She was the most famous woman in the country. He was just a single dad trying to pay the electric bill. What she asked him next would change both their lives forever. Every night he did the math alone. Every night it came up short. He had no idea a stranger's offer was about to change everything, led, for better or for worse. It was supposed to be an act, a performance, a contract. But somewhere under all those camera flashes, something neither of them planned for started to feel real. He warned him to walk away quietly. He had no idea this quiet, ordinary man was about to become the one thing he couldn't control. No cameras, no contracts, no audience left to perform for. Just 3 people, and a truth that turned out to be bigger than the lie that almost destroyed them.
If you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, or if you have ever had to pretend to be someone you are not just to survive one more day, this story is going to hit you right in the chest. So stay until the end, because the final 10 minutes will completely change how you see everyone in this story. Before we start, if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because it truly helps this story reach more people who need to hear it tonight. David Reyes had learned over the last 3 years that grief does not announce itself. It simply moves into your house, sits at your kitchen table every morning, and refuses to leave. He was 34 years old, a carpenter by trade, with rough hands and a soft heart, raising his 6-year-old daughter Lily alone since his wife Maria had passed away from a sudden illness. Their small house on Ashwood Lane still smelled faintly of Maria's lavender candles, and David had never had the heart to throw the last one away. Every night he tucked Lily into bed, read her the same 3 books because she refused to let go of them, and then sat alone in the dark kitchen doing the math on bills that never seemed to add up. He worked 2 jobs, framing houses during the day and doing furniture repair in the evenings, and still, some months, he had to choose between the electric bill and new shoes for Lily's growing feet. He was not a man who complained. He simply worked and loved his daughter fiercely and tried not to think too much about the life he had once imagined for the 3 of them. Everything changed on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of gray afternoon that gives no warning of what is coming. David was finishing a delivery of a repaired antique dresser to a gated estate on the edge of town when a woman in oversized sunglasses and a plain baseball cap stepped out from behind a hedge and asked him, in a voice that seemed almost afraid of itself, if he had a few minutes to talk. It took him nearly 30 seconds to realize the woman standing in front of him, dressed down and trying so hard to look ordinary, was Elena Vaughn. The Elena Vaughn, the singer and actress whose face had been on magazine covers and billboards for the better part of a decade, the woman half the country seemed to have an opinion about. David almost dropped the dresser's drawer he was carrying when he recognized her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the 2 of them standing on a gravel driveway that felt, absurdly, like the most ordinary place in the world for a conversation that was about to be anything but ordinary. Elena kept glancing over her shoulder toward the hedge, as though she expected someone to be watching even out here, far from any camera. And David realized with a small jolt that this was probably how she lived every single day, always half watching the tree line for someone who might be photographing her simply existing. Elena's life looked from the outside like everything David's was not: glamorous, wealthy, adored. But underneath the surface, her world had been quietly collapsing for months. Her longtime manager and former fiancé, a smooth-talking man named Victor Hale, had spent years positioning himself as her protector while secretly rerouting portions of her earnings into shell investments under his own name and manipulating the press narrative whenever it served him. When Elena had finally broken off their engagement 6 months earlier after catching him in a lie about missing funds, Victor had responded not with an apology, but with a campaign of quiet sabotage, leaking half-true stories to gossip outlets, painting her as unstable and difficult, all while positioning himself as the loyal, wounded party the public should sympathize with. Elena's reputation, built over 10 hard years, was cracking under the weight of lies she could not publicly disprove. Without revealing financial details that would destroy her family's charitable foundation in the process, there was one more complication. Elena's grandmother, Margaret Vaughn, the matriarch who had funded and inspired the family's foundation, was gravely ill and had one final wish before she passed: to see Elena settled, married, and happy, believing because Victor had convinced her of it during their engagement. That stability was the one thing missing from Elena's chaotic public life. Margaret controlled a trust that, if certain conditions around family stability were not met, would default its considerable assets, not to Elena's charitable foundation for children's hospitals, but to a distant cousin with no interest in continuing that work. Elena was not doing this for vanity. She was doing it to protect her grandmother's final wish, to protect the foundation that funded surgeries for children who could not otherwise afford them, and to buy herself enough time to gather proof of what Victor had actually done. She needed, for a period of perhaps 2 months, to appear to have a husband, a decent, real, unimpeachable man who would stand beside her at her grandmother's bedside and at a handful of public events, so that the story Victor was writing about her could be quietly starved of oxygen. She had seen David only once before, months earlier, when he'd fixed a broken gate at a friend's charity event and refused payment because "some things you just do for people," she had asked around discreetly. Everyone described him the same way: honest, quiet, devoted to his little girl. She needed someone the public and the tabloids could not find a single ugly thing to say about, because there wasn't one. She offered him an amount of money that would clear every debt he had, fund Lily's education, and give them both breathing room for the first time in years, in exchange for 2 months of pretending, carefully and respectfully, to be her husband. David said no the first time. He said no the second time, too. It was Lily, of all people, who tipped the decision. Not because she understood any of it, but because David had come home that week to a shut-off notice taped to the door, and he'd had to explain to his daughter gently why the lights would be off for a few days. That night, staring at the ceiling, David thought about Maria and what she would have wanted for their daughter, and he called Elena back the next morning and said yes, on one condition: that nothing about this ever touched Lily's heart if it wasn't real. Elena agreed without hesitation. She had grown up in front of cameras and understood, more than most, what it meant to protect a child's heart. They built their story carefully, a quiet romance that had supposedly started a year earlier, kept private because David valued his daughter's normal life. A lawyer drew up a strict agreement: respectful distance in private, a believable partnership in public, a clean and quiet end after 2 months with a fair explanation to the press about growing apart amicably. It should have been simple. It was not because neither of them had accounted for what actually happens when 2 lonely, guarded people are asked to act every day like they care for each other. The first time David saw Elena outside of the estate, she was standing in his driveway in an oversized coat, looking utterly out of place among the sawdust and the half-finished porch railing he had been working on for a neighbor. "I thought famous people traveled with an entourage," he said, only half joking, and Elena had answered quietly that an entourage was just a nicer word for an audience, and she was tired of performing for one every hour of every day. That was the first time he saw past the magazine version of her. Not a woman who had everything, but a woman who had been alone in a crowded room for a very long time. He didn't say anything else about it. He simply handed her a spare pair of work gloves and let her help him sand the railing, because it seemed like the kind of quiet, ordinary task a person who was tired of performing might actually want. Their first public appearance together was a charity dinner neither of them wanted to attend, in a ballroom so bright with camera flashes that David had to fight the instinct to shield his eyes like he did on a job site when the sun hit sheet metal wrong. He wore a rented suit that did not quite fit in the shoulders, and when a photographer asked them to look like "you're in love," David froze completely, unsure what a person was even supposed to do with a request like that. Elena leaned toward him, laughing softly behind a practiced smile, and murmured, "Just tell me about Lily. Whatever you're thinking about her, think about it now. It always shows on your face." He did, and for the first time all night, the smile in the photographs was real, because he had been picturing his daughter's face when she lost her. First tooth 2 nights earlier, and insisted on putting it under her pillow. For good measure, as if the tooth fairy might need extra convincing. The first weeks were clumsy. Elena did not know how to sit in a small kitchen without an assistant hovering nearby. David did not know which fork belonged to which course at the one gala he was forced to attend, and he said so, out loud. To Elena, who laughed for the first time in months. A real laugh, not the practiced one from magazine interviews. Lily, who was told only that Miss Elena is a friend who is going to visit sometimes, took to Elena instantly, and, without complication, the way children often see through adult confusion straight to a person's actual heart. Elena started arriving early to help Lily with her reading homework, not because it was required by any contract, but because she wanted to. There was an evening, about 3 weeks in, when a sudden downpour trapped Elena at the house on Ashwood Lane far longer than planned. With no security detail scheduled to arrive until morning, and no graceful way to leave in the storm, she ended up sitting on the living room floor with Lily, building a cardboard castle out of old moving boxes David had never gotten around to breaking down. Elena, who had walked red carpets in gowns worth more than the house itself, spent 2 hours that night with marker stains on her hands, helping a 6-year-old decide whether the castle needed a moat. David watched from the kitchen doorway, pretending to dry dishes that were already dry, and felt something in his chest loosen for the first time since Maria's funeral. Not romance exactly, not yet, but the simple, disorienting relief of not being the only adult in the house trying to hold everything together. Margaret Vaughn, weak but sharp-eyed, watched all of this from her hospital bed, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had waited a long time to see her granddaughter look, even briefly, at peace. "You look different," she told Elena one afternoon. "Lighter." Elena did not correct her. She was surprised to realize she did not want to. It was Margaret, too, who first noticed what neither David nor Elena had yet admitted to themselves. During one hospital visit, watching David patiently help her adjust her pillows without being asked while Elena fetched water, Margaret caught her granddaughter's eye and said nothing at all, just smiled the particular smile of an old woman who has seen enough of the world to recognize the real thing when it walks quietly into a room, wearing work boots instead of a tuxedo. Victor Hale noticed the shift too, and it enraged him. His entire narrative depended on Elena appearing isolated, unstable, and alone. A woman who needed him specifically to manage her life and her image. A quiet, steady single father with a shy smile and an adoring little daughter was the worst possible headline for him. So Victor did what men like him always do when they feel control slipping. He escalated. He hired a private investigator to dig into David's background, hoping to find debt, a criminal record, an ex-wife with an ugly story. Anything usable he found nothing damaging because there was nothing to find, only a widower who had done nothing but work hard and love his daughter. Frustrated, Victor decided to manufacture what reality refused to give him. Victor began showing up uninvited to events he knew Elena would attend, always positioning himself just close enough to the cameras to be photographed looking wounded and concerned, playing the part of the heartbroken ex who only wanted the best for her. At one gallery opening, he cornered David near the coat check and, in a voice pitched low enough that no microphone could catch it, told him plainly that men like David were replaceable, that arrangements like this always ended the same way, with the ordinary man discarded once he had served his purpose, and that David would save himself a great deal of humiliation by walking away quietly now, on his own terms before the ending was written for him. David said nothing back. He simply looked at Victor the way he looked at a warped piece of lumber before deciding whether it was worth trying to salvage, and walked away. But the words stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit, a splinter of doubt he could not quite dig out. Unable to shake David loose with intimidation, Victor decided the story needed a villain the public would believe in, and he leaked a fabricated story to a tabloid claiming that David was being paid to play a role in Elena's life. Technically true in the driest legal sense, but Victor twisted it, adding invented details about David allegedly demanding more money and threatening to go public if he didn't get it. The story painted David as a predator exploiting a grieving, vulnerable celebrity, and it painted Elena as, once again, a poor judge of character who needed a real protector, meaning Victor. The story broke on a Thursday morning. By noon, photographers were camped outside the little house on Ashwood Lane. By that evening, Lily's school had received 2 calls from reporters trying to get a comment from a 6-year-old. This was the moment the story could have ended in tears rather than triumph. David wanted to fold immediately, to hold a press conference, admit everything, take the money out of the arrangement, and disappear back into his old, quiet, safe life, because he could not stomach the sight of his daughter's school being circled by strangers with cameras. Elena went to his house that night, without security, without a plan, for possibly the first time in her adult life walking somewhere without a script. She sat across from him at the same small kitchen table where he did his bill math every night, and she told him something she had never told anyone outside her own family. The real reason she needed this arrangement. The truth about Victor's theft, the trust, the foundation, her grandmother's failing health, all of it. "I lied to you about why," she said, "but I never lied about respecting you. I need you to know the difference." David thought that night about a conversation he'd had with Maria years earlier, back when Lily was still a baby and money had been just as tight, though for different reasons. Maria used to say that the truest measure of a person was not how they behaved when things were easy, but how they behaved when telling the truth would cost them something. She had said it about a coworker who'd taken the blame for someone else's mistake at her own expense, but David had never forgotten it. And sitting across from Elena that night, watching a woman with every reason to protect herself, instead choose to be honest with him even though it complicated everything, he heard Maria's voice again, clear as if she were standing in the doorway. It was not the money that made David decide to stay and fight instead of walk away. It was watching a woman the entire world thought had everything sit in his kitchen and admit she had almost nothing that was truly hers. Not her name in the headlines, not her own money, not even the story of her own life. He recognized that particular kind of exhaustion because grief and betrayal wear the same tired look on a person's face, whether they are a widowed carpenter or a famous singer. They decided, together, to stop playing defense. David, of all people, was the one who suggested it. You don't fight a liar by hiding better. You fight him by finally telling the truth louder than his lie. Elena had spent months protecting the foundation by staying silent about Victor. Now, with David, and, quietly, with the help of Margaret's old and fiercely loyal attorney, she began building an actual case. Bank records, her own forensic accountant could subpoena. An old assistant of Victor's willing to testify once she realized she wasn't the only one he'd manipulated. And message threads Victor had been careless enough to keep on a device he'd once let Elena borrow during their engagement and that her people had quietly imaged before returning. While the legal case was built in private, in public, Elena did something no one advised her to do. Instead of retreating from the tabloid story, she stepped directly into it. She gave one interview, calm and unshaking, in which she said plainly that yes, she had asked David for help during an extraordinarily difficult family situation, that his integrity throughout had been the one steady thing in months of chaos, and that anyone attacking a single father who works 2 jobs to support his daughter, in order to protect their own reputation, should ask themselves what kind of person does that. She did not name Victor. She did not need to. The public, who had watched Victor's smug, wounded fiancé routine for months, began to ask their own questions. Margaret Vaughn, hearing the whole truth for the first time from her hospital bed, was not angry with Elena for the deception. She was angry, quietly and completely, with herself, for having pushed so hard for stability that she had nearly handed her granddaughter's happiness, and the foundation's future, to a man who had been stealing from both of them the entire time. She revised the trust that same week with her attorney, closing the loophole Victor had been counting on and making the foundation's funding permanent regardless of anyone's marital status. "I don't need you settled," she told Elena, holding her hand. "I need you safe. There's a difference, and I nearly forgot it." There was a moment, in the middle of building the case, when Elena nearly lost her nerve entirely. Her own publicist, terrified of the brand damage, urged her to settle quietly with Victor, pay him off, and let the story fade the way most tabloid stories eventually do. Elena sat with that advice for exactly one night. She thought about the children's ward at the hospital her foundation funded, about a boy named Marcus she had visited the previous winter who had needed a surgery that would not have been possible without that money, and she thought about her grandmother's voice, tired but firm, telling her years earlier that the Vaughn name had never been for sale and never would be. By morning she had her answer, and it was not the quiet one. "I have spent 10 years letting other people manage what's true about me," she told her attorney. "I would rather lose everything telling the truth than keep any of it by staying silent." The unraveling of Victor Hale happened faster than anyone expected, the way these things often do once the first thread is pulled. The former assistant's sworn statement, combined with the financial records, gave Elena's legal team enough to refer the matter to actual investigators rather than fight it in the press. Victor's attempt to paint himself as the wronged party collapsed within days of the first subpoena, and outlets that had eagerly run his leaked stories now ran headlines about embezzlement allegations instead. He did not go quietly. He tried one final tabloid strike, an anonymous tip claiming Elena and David's entire relationship was staged, hoping to detonate the story before the embezzlement case buried him. But by then it did not matter. Elena's team was ready with something Victor never anticipated, the truth itself, told on her own terms. In a short statement, Elena confirmed that yes, her relationship with David had begun as an arrangement to protect her grandmother's peace of mind during a health crisis and to shield a children's foundation from a predator who had already stolen from it once. She said it without shame, because there was none to have. She said the arrangement had been honest in every way that mattered, decent, and time-limited by design, and that what had happened in the middle of it, unplanned and unscripted, was that she had fallen in love with a good man for entirely ordinary reasons. Because he was kind to her, because he was patient with her chaos, because he never once, not for a single day of the entire arrangement, asked her for anything beyond what they had agreed. The public response was not scandal. It was overwhelming warmth. People did not feel lied to. They felt like they had accidentally witnessed something real happen, inside something that had started as a performance. David never wanted any of this attention. And for a while after the truth came out, he considered pulling Lily and himself entirely out of public life, arrangement or no arrangement, feelings or no feelings. What changed his mind was Lily herself, who had grown genuinely attached to Elena over those months in a way that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with someone showing up, consistently, with patience and warmth, at a kitchen table every week. One evening Lily asked him, with the blunt honesty only a 6-year-old can manage, "Is Miss Elena going away now that the pretend part is over?" David did not have a rehearsed answer for that. He drove to Elena's grandmother's estate that same night and told her, plainly, the way he told the truth about everything else, that he did not want the pretending to end, because somewhere in the middle of it, it had stopped being pretend for him. Margaret Vaughn passed away peacefully 3 weeks later, with Elena, David, and even Lily at her bedside, having spent her final good days finally at ease watching her granddaughter loved by someone who had never once wanted anything from her but her honesty. Victor Hale was formally charged the following month, and the case became, in its own quiet way, a warning to every manager, publicist, and partner who has ever mistaken control over someone's image for love. Elena's foundation, protected and fully funded, expanded that year to cover twice as many children's hospital partnerships as before, something she made sure the press covered far more than her own personal life. In the quiet weeks after Margaret's passing and Victor's arrest, David and Elena did something neither of them had done since the arrangement began. Nothing at all, on purpose. No galas, no statements, no cameras. They spent an entire Saturday simply repainting Lily's bedroom a color she had chosen after 20 minutes of serious deliberation at the hardware store. And Elena, paint on her elbow and her famous hair tied back in a bandana, told David that it was, without question, the best Saturday she'd had in years. He believed her, because there was no camera left to perform for, and she said it anyway. David never took the money Elena had originally offered for the arrangement, not the way it had first been proposed. Instead, at his quiet insistence, it went into a fund at Lily's school for families going through exactly what his had gone through. Kids whose parents were choosing between electric bills and school supplies, the kind of quiet struggle no headline ever covers. He kept his 2 jobs a little while longer, out of stubborn pride more than necessity, until Elena, laughing, pointed out that at some point stubbornness stops being strength and starts being avoidance, and he finally let himself accept that being loved did not make him weak. A year later, on a modest afternoon with no cameras and no publicist and no arrangement of any kind, David and Elena were married in the backyard of the house on Ashwood Lane, under the same tree where Maria's lavender candles used to sit in the kitchen window. Lily, 7 years old now and missing 2 front teeth instead of 1, stood beside them holding flowers she had picked herself, entirely unbothered by the fact that the woman becoming her stepmother had once been on magazine covers, because to her, Elena had only ever been the person who showed up, every week, and never once made her feel like an inconvenience. There were only 20 guests, a folding table of homemade food instead of a catered spread, and a single photographer, a family friend, not a professional, hired only so that Lily could have pictures for the scrapbook she had started keeping the day. The pretend part, as she still called it, had quietly become real. At one point during the small reception, Elena found herself standing near the same kitchen window where Maria's lavender candle still sat, unlit, on the sill. She did not move it. She simply stood beside it for a moment and told David, quietly, that she hoped Maria would have liked her. David did not answer with words. He put his arm around her shoulder and looked out at Lily chasing fireflies across the yard in the last of the evening light, and that, more than anything he could have said, was answer enough. If this story taught anything, it is this. The people who try to control you by controlling the story about you will always, eventually, be undone by the simple, boring, unglamorous truth. Because lies require constant maintenance, and truth requires none. Real love, the kind that survives contracts and cameras and tabloids and grief, rarely announces itself with fireworks. Sometimes it starts as an arrangement at a kitchen table between two exhausted, guarded people who are simply trying to protect the ones they love. And somewhere in the middle of protecting each other, it becomes the realest thing either of them has ever had. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved you even a little, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment about the part that touched you the most. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach the people who need them.